I would now like to come to our feature lecturer on the impact of low oil prices on GCC economies, Professor Paul Stevens. Professor Stevens is a distinguished fellow at Chatham House in London. He trained in economics and as a specialist on the Middle East at Cambridge and at SOAS. And for his first teaching gig, went to Beirut, where he taught at the American University of Beirut from 1973 to 1979. Usually when we give spans of dates like that, it sounds fairly banal. But anyone who knows the history of Lebanon in particular will go 73 to 79. This was not a good career move.
It was, actually.
As it's turned out, it didn't hold you back, Paul. But they certainly were very difficult years to be teaching at the American University of Beirut. And I celebrate your tenacity that you saw through till 79. From Beirut, Paul came back to teach at the University of Surrey. And between 1993 and 2008, he was, and wait for it, Professor of Petroleum Policy and Economics at the Centre for Energy, Petroleum and Mineral Law and Policy at the University of Dundee. Now, I'm slightly joking in my introduction because Paul and I go way back. A summer gathering held by Oxford Analytica that we would do each year. And our mutual colleague, who was the head of the Middle East team, would always make such a hash of that title that I had to deliberately read it carefully to get it straight and just say, for once, Paul, I think we got it straight. He's Emeritus Professor at the University of Dundee, a visiting professor at UCL in Australia, and a distinguished fellow at the Institute of Energy Economics in Japan. And in 2009, fittingly, he was awarded the OPEC Award in recognition of his outstanding work in the field of oil and energy research. We're also really delighted that Paul has contributed an article to the latest issue of Gulf Affairs. So, with no more ado, may I invite Paul Stevens to the podium.
Thanks very much for that introduction, Eugene. Takes me back a while thinking about the old Oxford Analytica days, actually. Good morning. I'd like to thank the organisers for the invitation to talk to you. I've been asked to talk about the impact of low oil prices on the GCC economies, the implications for the private sector. And I've been given 10 minutes to do this in, which is, I do like a challenge, but I mean, this is going to be, I spent ages with my sound bites, putting them in different orders. Since June 2014, as we know, oil prices have fallen. Between 2011 and 2014, the average price of oil was $110 a barrel in real terms. In January this year, it went below $30 a barrel. However, beware of talking about low oil prices. People who talk about low oil prices have no sense of history. Between 1986 and 2004, the average price of oil in real terms was $33 a barrel. So the sort of prices we've seen recently are not that low. They are lower than they have been, but certainly not low. Now, there's been a great many effects and consequences of this on the region, but the key impact I want to talk about here is the realization in the GCC countries of the need to diversify away from dependence on oil. Now, this is not a new realization. Eugene referred to my first proper job in AUB, and I remember in October 74 attending a lecture by an oil minister from the GCC, who should remain nameless, who stood up and said, we realise we have to now diversify away from crude oil. We're going to have to build lots of refineries for when the oil runs out, which caused quite an interesting reaction in the room, I can assure you. And it wasn't Zaki Yamani, by the way. He would have been far too smart to say anything like that. But clearly this has been on the agenda for a long time. In reality, however, it's been going backwards. The diversification efforts have really failed pretty abysmally if you look at the numbers. Now, why then diversify now? I think there are two reasons. First of all, post-Paris and COP21, the writing is on the wall for the future of hydrocarbons. And the large reserve holders of oil and gas are effectively going to be facing a lot of stranded assets as we go forward. The second reason to diversify, and this may sound a bit strange, is that oil revenue is not income. Oil revenue is not income. A country has a portfolio of assets. One of the elements of that portfolio is crude oil below ground. If you produce it and sell it, all you're doing is reshuffling the national portfolio of assets. You're exchanging a black barrel of oil for some dollars above ground. And the point here, of course, is because oil is depletable, either in a natural depletion sense or because demand will disappear. Remember Zaki Yamani's famous comment that the Stone Age did not end because we ran out of stones, the Oil Age will not end because we run out of oil. This is exactly the same sort of thinking. So what you have to do is you have to take the dollars above the ground and then create income-earning assets, otherwise the rest of the economy becomes unsustainable. And this, of course, is where the private sector comes in, or not, as the case may be. There are a great many barriers to developing the private sector, but this will be absolutely key to develop those income-earning assets. Governments are very bad at picking winners. Losers are very good at picking governments. It will come down to the private sector to be able to do this sort of thing. And the governments are going to have to consider how to reform these barriers because the prices are going to stay lower for some time. Now, there's been a little bit of a recovery in price since January. This morning, Brent was $50.46, which is up from below the 30s of January. Now, there's some specific explanations for this. There's an element of dead cat bounce. I put that in for those students of financial commodity markets who will know what I'm talking about. There's also been physical outages. The Canadian fires, for example, means we've lost about 1 million barrels a day of production. Nigeria production is down as well. There are also growing geopolitical fears which have pushed the price up. But the reality is we're in a world where there is now a price ceiling for oil. Let me introduce you to a new word in the English language, a backlog. You all know what a backlog is. You have a list of things to do. At the end of the day, you've done half of them. What's left is the backlog. The backlog refers to the fact that in the United States, a large number of wells have been drilled but not completed. They were drilled because the terms of the lease forced the drilling. They were not completed because the price was too low. When the price reaches a certain level, and I'm not sure what it is, it's probably between about $55, $60 a barrel, those wells will be completed and also new supplies will come back on. So as the price goes up, you're going to get an influx of supply which will choke off any increase in price. Now, price forecasting is one of the most dangerous occupations I know of. And any price forecast needs a sort of political warning. Geopolitics can come along and bite you on the leg. Somebody in the Middle East can do something outrageously stupid. We've seen a lot of that over the last 50 years. If that happens, then of course the price could go back up very quickly indeed. However, I think for the next few years, leaving that sort of event aside, you're looking at a ceiling of $60 to $70. I think this is now realised in the Gulf, and governments are really trying to reform and encourage the private sector to develop. I suppose the most extreme example, at least in terms of rhetoric, is Saudi Arabia's new transformation plan, the sort of Vision 2030. Now, there are real problems here in promoting the private sector in the GCC. I'll just mention a couple of them. Markets do work, but they work very, very badly. The first thing governments learn about market forces is that the market forces governments to intervene on this and intervene on that. This mindless belief in the power of markets is fortunately dying. 2 weeks ago, the IMF, albeit 18 years late, more or less admitted that the sort of neoclassical economics that had underwritten the plan was actually a mistake. The World Bank had realised this in 1998 after the collapse of Russia, but the IMF had taken a long time to get there. So there is a danger, if you have a mindless belief in the power of markets, that you end up making a total mess of it. The second problem is a problem with education. When I was in Saudi in January, all of the youngsters who were sort of driving these new ideas were very excited about the ideas of a knowledge economy. We're going to have a knowledge economy. I hate that. What does it mean? I mean, it really is the ultimate piece of consultancy speak as far as I'm concerned. But one of the things you do know, if you're going to have a knowledge economy, you have to educate your population. And the problem is, if you educate people, they actually want to have a say in the way in which they're governed. And this is a bit of a problem. And this brings me on to my last concern, and it goes back, and Eugene will remember this, I used to bang on about this 10 or 15 years ago. If we go back to the Soviet Union of the sort of Gorbachev era, there was a big debate about perestroika versus glasnost. Perestroika, economic liberalization, glasnost, political liberalization. And the argument was, if you want to have economic reform, economic liberalization, you have to have political reform as well. That was Gorbachev's argument. The Chinese said, well, we like perestroika, but forget the glasnost bit. As far as the GCC are concerned, this is a major issue. Are the ruling elites willing to allow the private sector to actually go and do what they're supposed to do? One of the big problems, for example, in Saudi Arabia is really a lack of property rights. And unless you get those sort of property rights, then you're not going to see much development from a private sector point of view. Saudi Arabia has a very active private sector, but a lot of the stuff they do is done outside of the kingdom. So the question is, if you're going to have economic reform, economic liberalization, which will be, by the way, essential for diversification, you're going to have some sort of leverage on the political side as well. And on that rather controversial note, thank you very much for your attention.